All right, we are now live for November's political theory and this discussion. I kind of thought, there wouldn't be any point in talking about any other issue. I will run into a lot of issues other than the election because it is such a major, significant development, as I think pretty much everybody around the world knows at this time. Joe Biden has won the election. There's still counting going on, believe it or not, in some places. And we talk about why that is actually the case. There's a whole bunch of stories that can be told about that. And there's still some diehards who are saying, no, that's not the case. Wait until all the lawsuits are done. But for the most part, it's been called. And we can say that there is going to be hopefully a fairly peaceful transition of power. There were some crazinesses in moving from one administration to the other in the past. Hopefully that sort of stuff will be avoided. And this has been quite a important and momentous election. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I think are worth bringing up, and then I'm going to take questions and comments from everybody and see what we can do with them. I think I might adjust the screen there a little bit and maybe see if I can't fix this. There we go. That's a little bit better as far as lighting goes. So the election is, for all intents and purposes, finished. And, it's taken not quite a week, but a good part of a week to get full results. And because of the technology and the means that we're using, especially the heavy reliance on mail-in ballots, on all sorts of, modes of sorting and counting, it took quite a bit longer in many places. And there have been some challenges, and there have been a number of lawsuits filed. Most of them seem to be almost entirely without merit. Many of them have been thrown out already. It looks as if even if any of the ones that have merit go forward, there's really not much of a chance of anything being overturned as far as the vote count. So we've got something that's a reliable result, we can say. And, it's a major issue. We're talking about the entire executive branch, which has been under a very unusual regime, as we'll talk about in a bit, not even really comparable to other recent Republican regimes in terms of the extremely high turnover, the chaos caused by it, the level of constant scandals and agitation and stuff like that. So, people are talking about this as a return to normalcy. We'll get into that issue, I'm pretty sure. I don't think there actually is any real return to a normal after what's been going on. But we can say that there is a resolution, right? And there's still some runoffs that have to occur for various legislative seats. So not everything is completely finished with the election cycle. And we can say that neither side, I mean, in one respect, you can say both sides had a great turnout, right? That's kind of nice. And it did promote a lot of interest in the political system and participation more than usual. And that's in general a good thing. Neither side can be said to have a mandate. Trump definitely didn't have a mandate for his administration. It doesn't look like we can say that the Biden administration has a mandate either, but I don't think that we actually need mandates. It's, in this point in time, governance is probably more important. And, as with previous elections, the losing side has some choices in front of them. Do they want to contest things? Do they want to say, well, we lost this time, we need to actually do some real reflection on why we lost, as we saw the Republicans trying to do somewhat during the Obama years, that they picked the wrong answers, of course, with going down the Tea Party route. And the Democrats tried to do that during the Bush years as well. or do they simply, stick to their guns and reinforce their message and try to obstruct as much as possible? Well, those are things that we don't really know. We'll see what happens. And one thing to keep in mind is that, so here I'm going to say something about the American political system and our economic system and legislative system and all that sort of stuff. And I'm saying this primarily for the non-Americans out there who think that things are a little bit simpler than they are. But I'm also saying this for a lot of Americans, because I think a lot of Americans have very oversimplistic conceptions of these sorts of things. It doesn't matter how much you win the popular vote. That's another thing. It's bragging rights, but it doesn't get you elected. And, a state isn't red or blue in a real sense. They're all mosaics. They're all fragments. Milwaukee right here is a pretty blue thing. You get around the rings of the three main counties around us, and they're all pretty hard red, except in certain places. And so when we generalize about, for example, I'll give you a prime example. Somebody came up with, this, I'm going to go on a road trip to celebrate, and they only went through blue states. And then somebody else pointed out on their map, you think that a state that went 49% for Biden and 51% for Trump is fundamentally different than a state that went, the opposite? No, these things are very, very complicated. A lot of people don't understand how much of politics here in America is local in the sense of depending on particular states, and how every single state is a different animal from the next state over. So you've got to take cognizance of that. Looking at, a big number like, well, who got more popular vote? Well, that's nice, right? But it's not really that relevant. You got to get, as we say, a bit more granular. And that's part of why it's so hard to change things here in America. I've talked about this in the past with respect to policing, with respect to education, with respect to healthcare. Things are not run just on a federal level. Once we actually have an administration that's a little bit more competent in charge, and we restore the civil service to not being so much patronage but more professional, that's going to help out. But it's not going to help out that much. The federal government can do some things on a big scale. A lot of other things are up to the states, they're up to the cities, they're up to the counties. And so this is not going to produce dramatic change. Even if Biden had a Reagan style against Mondale in 84 electoral victory, it still wouldn't change everything the way that a lot of people are thinking that it should. So that's something to really keep in mind. We do have a very deeply fractured nation, and it's deeply fractured not just along state lines like blue states versus red states. It's fractured within those states. It's fractured within institutions. It's fractured within cities. And one has to be attentive to these fault lines, I think, going forward. And, try to avoid making sweeping assumptions that just because somebody's from this county, they're automatically, supporting the Republicans, or because somebody's going to this university, they're automatically supporting the Democrats. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing that I want to sort of put out there is we have some really significant problems as a nation that we have to face. And I'm not going to be, calling for some sort of illusory unity that we all have to somehow get on the same page. I'm just going to say if we don't, we're screwed. And some of this has to do with things that are bigger than the United States, like, of course, the environmental issues that, some people might say, oh, climate change not really happening. You can just look outside here in Wisconsin and see that it has happened, and species are moving in. It's, we were able to walk around and take a nice stroll today, just wearing, flannels, when normally we'd have snow falling by this time when I was a kid. And, the smart money, the military, the Rand Corporation, all these insurance companies, they know that climate change is happening. And so we have to figure out what we're going to do, what we can do. And having a bunch of deniers as your dialogue partners and having a bunch of Democrats who are very often in the pocket of corporate interests is not going to be conducive to that. We also need to change things when it comes to, clear inequities in policing, in education, in healthcare. We have some major problems, and these are not going to go away, and they're not going to be resolved by returning to some idyllic time that never existed before people were, getting woke or agitating or anything like that. We've got to deal with these problems. If we don't, then we become a failed state. We go back to the back of the line where we've been heading for quite some time, not just in the Trump administration, but also under the Bush and Obama administrations on many measures. If we can't find some way to work these things out politically, and that's an open question, we are going to be screwed. So we're going to have to figure out how to deal with those. We're also going to have to figure out what to do with an economy where I think we can expect to see many people unable to find work, unable to find sufficiently remunerative work because of all the developments of AI and logistics and automation, which are not going to stop, right? Now, those may be problems that are worse in some other countries, but those are some significant issues that we have to face. We can't just, send everybody to college and then, that'll be the pipeline to jobs afterwards. We have to do some serious thinking. And our current political leadership, Biden and Harris included, but the Trump administration, if Biden and Harris are problematic in that respect, the Trump administration was just a bunch of loonies in those matters. So I don't know where we go in dealing with those significant, major scale political issues. I don't know if our system can handle it. Somebody's mentioned the Electoral College. I also wanted to talk about the Electoral College because a lot of foreigners and a lot of Americans say we should get rid of this thing. And you're right, we should. It's a stupid system. It's awful. It gives all these stupid priorities to states that shouldn't have them. Here's the problem. It would take a constitutional amendment to get rid of it. And that ain't going to happen. If you think that it's difficult to get normal legislation passed in this hyper-partisan climate, do you think you're really going to be able to have a constitutional convention and get entire states to agree to this supermajority required to change the Constitution? It just won't happen. The American Constitution, I've said this before in the past, but I'm going to use this metaphor again. The American Constitution, when it was first developed, was not bad. It was pretty good. As a matter of fact, a lot of places looked at us and they're like, oh yeah, we should do something like this as well. And so we got in on the game very early on. And it's sort of like building, a nice automobile back around 1920. It's great for 1920. And if you're into classic cars, that's awesome, but you can't take it on the interstate. You can't take it on any real highway, and it's constantly needing repair that it's not getting. And at a certain point, you've got to realize that the newer models are way, way better in so many other measures than the one that you've got. But imagine now that you can't change your car once you've got it. You're stuck with it, and you're never going to be able to get away with changing it. You can put a new paint job on it if you want. You can add some fins. You can make a few new parts or something like that. But you're basically stuck with a 1920s engine and transmission and suspension and brakes and all these things. Even maybe the radio is not so good, right? It's a radio with a tape deck, an 8-track tape deck instead of a CD player or anything else, right? Well, that's our Constitution, and we're kind of stuck with it. And so in many respects, because of the hyper-partisan climate that we're in, we're screwed. That's another one of those things where we really would need to fix things up. I do also want to talk about two other things before I start addressing some of these questions and comments. One of these is the problem of having essentially a political party, the Republican Party, one of our main parties, that has been really taken over by some key themes that are in the long run and in an ethical point of view quite bad. I understand that a lot of people are very passionate about Second Amendment rights. We have a major problem with gun violence and the access to firearms, and that they stand in the way of that all the time. Mitt Romney is a prime example of somebody. He tweeted today that now the election's over. He voted. I think he voted for Biden because Trump is such just a hot mess, right? And went after Romney personally all these times. And then he said, now we're going to make sure that there is no Medicare for all. There is no, moving things forward on the environment. Essentially it's just an obstructionist platform. We're going to do everything we can to try to keep things backwards and, resist any sort of progress. That's the Republican Party. Add in some heavy doses of racism and an individualistic conception of freedom that says screw my neighbor, COVID denial, and now QAnon, as sort of a cancer metastasizing within all these ranks. And you've got some pretty problematic stuff. So the Republicans, I'm an independent. So I am pretty critical of both parties. I vote strategically against who I think is the worst evil or who has the better prospects for things. I've voted for Republicans in the past. The Republican Party of today, it's just a mess. And they know that the only way that they can hold on to power is through voter suppression and through gerrymandering and all these things that are anti-democratic. That's a really bad sign. Also by appealing to the worst instincts of people. The Democrat Party's got a lot of problems too, beholden to many corporations and corporate interests. Biden has a long-standing, connection to the banking industry. We have some serious issues with debt that we need to resolve. But here's the thing: we can actually push the Democrats and say, you need to do the right thing on these things. And that's what I plan to be doing in the next years, is spending a good bit of time doing advocacy for the things that I think that need to be fixed, and doing a lot of local organizing and working with organizations. And so there's this issue of one party essentially having like gone off a crazy cliff, and then the other party being, it's okay, but it's not great. What do we do? Well, we're stuck with them, and so we've got to work with that. I think that in some cases you have to cordon off the crazy and refuse to cooperate with them. Our local, Republicans here in Wisconsin are a prime example of pretty crazy stuff. You look at our Supreme Court and the decision that invalidated the governor's mask mandate, where one of the justices was talking about it being tyranny, and you're like, man, these people are nuts. We still have to find ways to work with them. So that brings me to the last topic that I want to talk about. I see all these calls for like empathy and reconciliation, Trumpies and their supporters who just, a few days ago were rallying 2 blocks from here. They just didn't understand what they were getting into. And it's not going to do any good to be mean to them and say mean things to them. And, my attitude, first of all, as a Democrat, I'm not a Democrat. So if I was a Democrat, I'd be saying, well, screw you, because you did the same thing when you were in charge. So now we're going to do the same thing. As an independent, I'm, like, wow, I don't owe anybody anything. I certainly don't owe anybody any empathy. And if I'm going to give empathy, it's going to be to the victims of the Trump regime. It's definitely not going to be to anybody who supported the Trump regime, because the only way you get empathy after supporting somebody like Trump is by saying, holy crap, was I wrong? I need to do things to fix this. If they want to do that, then I'll entertain conversations with them about how they can make themselves into better people. But man, until they do that, forget it. And all these people out there lecturing about, well, you don't want to be as bad as them. We don't have to worry about that. They were really, really bad. They still are really, really bad. A lot of them are still, hardcore racists, applauding, all sorts of things to suppress people's votes, applauding excessive police violence. there's no reason why we have to feel bad for them or anything like that. They can go sort out their hurt feelings on their own. And some people are saying, oh, well, you're preparing for a Trump victory in 2024. Trump probably is not going to be around even in 2024. Because, I mean, look at the health that he's in. Even put that aside. Enough people have seen through his BS at this point. You know, the pin pricked the balloon. He's not going to be around. You could say, well, there might be another person like that. Yeah, we can make all sorts of predictions. I think that a lot of this call for empathy and reconciliation is very, it's very self-serving. It's people who really like that sort of thing, maybe even have a stake in coaching people how to do it, that want to push that. The peacemakers, right? You shouldn't always make peace. And we also have to keep this in perspective. Calling somebody an asshole on Twitter is not like burning their house down. It's not knocking the food out of their children's mouths or anything like that, you know? So this touchiness on the part of conservative snowflakes and liberal snowflakes who don't want anyone to criticize the Trump regime or its followers or anything like that, it's really quite silly. And so, you know, they can live up to the same standards as anybody else. If you screw up, if you break things, you fix them, then you get to apologize. And then it's up to the other person to say whether they want to go along with you or not. The last thing I'll actually say too is that I think the Democrats, there's a lot of discussion about what should the Democrats be doing? Should they have a more, progressive message? Should they try to be centrist? I'll say this as an independent, right? So somebody who is in the middle. I want to see the Democrats actually being progressive. I want to see an alternative. This is part of why Clinton lost. There are a number of reasons why she lost, but the party, when it's an establishment thing, it's not really putting forth a new alternative to the Republicans, and it's not usually doing what's right. I mean, universal health care is the way to go. That would be the right thing to do. I don't care who puts it in place. If the Republicans put it in place, I'll applaud them for doing that. Unfortunately, they're too nuts right now to even consider that, because that would be socialism. If the Democrats do it, independents like me would be for that. I'm not on the left, but I would like to see the left play a much bigger role in the Democratic Party. And they can count on people like me voting that way in swing states like Wisconsin. So when Democrats say, oh, if we're not pushing, more to the center and like getting in good with these Republicans, we're going to lose votes. That's true in some counties. That's not true everywhere. And that's not true of all constituencies. All right. So a lot of stuff here that people have been writing. Let me start taking some of these questions. Barklord says, are there effective ways to get older relatives to examine their fusion of Christianity, patriotism, right libertarianism, and white supremacist racism? It's kind of a case-by-case thing. There are some people who are so far off in nutty land that they're never coming back. And, it could have been something else. They could have been nutty about some fandom. They could have been nutty selling stuff for Amway, but they happen to have shifted into this. Some you can reach. And the way that you reach them is by maintaining contacts and by being firm in where you actually stand. Not saying, oh, well, I'll just keep everything under wraps. You treat them like you would anybody else. And if they want to say stuff that's bullshit, and you think it's bullshit, you can tell them that it's bullshit, and you can do that in nice ways and you can do that in mean ways, right? And you can also preface it with, I love you because you're in my family, but I think you're dead wrong about this stuff. And so many people will come back from the brink that way. I think so many of us every once in a while need somebody to come along and say, wow, you really are acting like an asshole and you don't have any good reason for it. And this, I'm not happy to see this. People need messages like that rather than just being treated with kid gloves. And it shouldn't go into, if they get upset about that, well, sorry you're upset. I'll see you next Saturday, next time we have some family get together or something like that. But I'm not going to hang around and listen to this. I think that's in many respects the way to go. But there might be some relatives who you got to be, more standoffish with. And there's some relatives where you could do like Socratic questioning. Although usually people get pretty pissed off when you do Socratic questioning. It's part of why they killed Socrates. But I think that you keep engaged. I don't think that there's any moral obligation to like continue conversations past points where it's clearly useless. That doesn't mean that you can't have further conversations down the line, but if somebody's, it really depends on how far down they've gone. And with the Christianity thing, the great thing about Christianity is there's things called the Gospels where Jesus actually preached things like, taking care of the poor, and you can bring up those quotes, or you could like bring up Thomas Aquinas's favorite quote from Isaiah: "Woe to those who call good evil, evil good, darkness light, light darkness, bitter sweet, and sweet bitter," and say, "Well, what do you think about this? How you doing with the Sermon on the Mount, Grandpa?" And they may get all ticked off, but at a certain point, enough of that pressure can get them to say, "Wow, I really am acting in an anti-Christian way. What's going on with me? How did I slide down this chute into thinking that flying a Blue Lives Matter flag could somehow be an example of Christianity when it's really the opposite?" So that might be a way to do it. Patriotism, you could talk about people who are actual patriots, like all the soldiers who enforced the disarming of Dixie, you could say, during Reconstruction. They were patriots. People they fought against definitely weren't. And there's ways in which you can like turn their stuff on its head, but you got to do a bit of work with that. Jay Crass, I wouldn't say the Democrats won by a large enough margin. It's not a good sign. It's good enough. It's what it is. Anything could be better in some ideal universe, but we have to do politics where we are, I'd say. Jasmine Hamilton has a question about Locke's moral philosophy. That's not what we're doing here. This isn't an AMA. This is a political theory and practice discussion. All right. Mark says the Electoral College is a weird thing. Yeah, almost everywhere they have better systems for deciding things than this stupid, crazy Electoral College. But as I mentioned, we're really stuck with it. There's no way effectively to get rid of it. And so we have to work within its confines. I'll say another thing too, that's, there's two other things that I see in other countries that I really wish we had here. One is many countries do not allow electoral campaigns beyond a certain point in time. So it could be like you can do, 8 weeks out from the election and that's it. You can't start doing all sorts of political action committees and campaigning and doing all this stuff a year before. I think it's really bad for us that we're in a perpetual election cycle much of the time. That's part of what leads to this massive polarization. It's not to say that people couldn't talk politics outside of that time, but I think that there shouldn't be, I think we need, well, we're not going to get it, but ideally we would get a system where you don't get to start campaigning basically once you've been elected. It's really bad too for the House of Representatives because their terms are every 2 years. So they are like on every election cycle. The other thing is, there are some places where we Americans make it very difficult in some places for certain people to vote, right? Usually happens to minorities and poor people that we make it hard for them to vote. I would love to see voting be required, and you pay a fine if you don't vote, like in some countries, but we don't have that. So Harry Tallboys, the problem is America is so big, it's almost like trying to run a continent rather than a country. I guess, you could say similar things about Russia, China, India, to a certain extent, Brazil, Canada too is pretty large. They don't have as big of a population, but they certainly have their challenges. I don't know that it's I don't know that it's really about the trying to run a continent. There are some significant differences between regions in America. and how things are done and how things are understood. But at the same time, there's also sort of a broad culture that's shared as well. So yeah, that's I'd have to think more about that. All right. Skip says path to a failed state since about the mid 90s for sure. Yeah, some of this goes back even further. You might say all in on globalization and the loss of our industrial base. That's a significant problem, in part because not just of losing track of where things are being built and having these incredibly long supply chains, but also because of what it did to wages and things like that. Yeah, the 90s were a deceptive, so I'll say something that I was saying to somebody else in a conversation earlier this week. The 1990s, as far as I remember them, and I was a college student back then, they were a time when the idea seemed to be, and this is what third wave Democrats were all about, they kept saying it's the economy, stupid. You grow the economy and you're making a bigger pie. And so even if you don't solve like the inequities within the pie, you're getting a bigger pie, so everybody's doing better overall, right? Which is not the same thing as like trickle-down economics, which is what Reagan was all about, where you make people richer on top and then they will create jobs and all that, which turned out to be complete nonsense. That doesn't. But neither did grow the pie thing, because the inequities are still there. And then when the pie shrinks again, like it did in the 2000s a number of times, then people are more ticked off because they can see that the inequities have been there and just get perpetuated. And sometimes they're even worse, a more unequal share of the pie. You look at wages compared to, and wage growth compared to what the top 1% or the top 10% are earning. So yeah, there's some real issues. The failed state thing, I mean, we're not at the point yet where we have full-scale militias going, but the fact that we had people try to kidnap the Michigan governor and people trying to affect the vote count in Philly, driving up with rifles, right? And that we have all these people coming to marches and protests with guns. That shouldn't be the case at all. That's a really bad sign. That is a sign of moving towards a failed state. We have a lot of indices where, I mean, medically too. I mean, our healthcare system is it's not a system. It's actually a whole bunch of interlocking systems that connect with each other, most of which don't work particularly well for most people. So we got some serious issues to deal with. Morgan says, how do you deal with family members who've joined the MAGA cult? I'm thinking of cutting them off in my life. They live in a different dimension. I think it's perfectly fine to do that. And you don't necessarily have to like give them a big FU before you cut them out. You can just like de-emphasize, you could say. You could be like, listen, I'm not going to spend time with you. And if they want to ask why, you can say, I don't want to hear your rhetoric. I don't see eye to eye with you on really basic values. That's okay to do. If you want to keep engaged with them, that's also okay to do. Both of those I think are legitimate. I think that this is a big problem that is running down the middle of many families, particularly many extended families. It's also affecting workplaces. It's also affecting, colleges and universities. But it's not as if you owe them anything. It would be as if they had decided to join some other cult, except in this case, there aren't really a lot of deprogrammers, right? Because they don't recognize that they're in a cult. Jasmine says, found some of your videos on divine law and natural law with Thomas Aquinas. They're helpful. Well, that's good. Xenocrat says, I hear you, Morgan. Thanksgiving this year is going to be awkward. Well, I mean, we're not going to be with anybody for Thanksgiving ourselves because of COVID. I think that's another thing too. The whether or not you take COVID seriously or view wearing a mask and social distancing as tyranny against your liberty or something like that. That's one of those dividing lines. And I think it's perfectly fine to say, listen, you don't actually take COVID seriously. We're not coming to your household. We're in the middle of a pandemic still that has not gone away. Um, Thanks, Alex. That's very, very nice of you. Let's see what we have. Craig says it's the increasing pace of change that forces us into separate camps. Some love it, some hate it. Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, whether or not you think that say racial equity issues should be resolved is another thing that's really separating us, or whether you think policing needs to be brought under some sort of control so that all these supposed bad apples can be gotten rid of. That's another big dividing issue. Brenda asked, do you agree with some that the hard left hurt the Democrats? I take hard left to mean Marxist-Leninists. I mean, there's not many Marxist-Leninists out there. There's a lot more people on the left than there are actual devoted Marxist-Leninists. I mean, this is one of these, this is a good question, because this is one of these things where what I was saying about, you got to look at these things granularly. There are places where being identified with, say, defund the police, or working for ending racism, or any of these sorts of things that are viewed as almost both socialist and utopian, where it could hurt you, right? There's a lot of places where the people who ran on were not that way. They lost, and maybe a more progressive candidate would have won. I know that I'm going to vote for, if it aligns with what I think as a virtue ethicist needs to happen, as somebody who's looking at the long term, I'm going to vote for people who are actually going to espouse and probably work for the kind of policies that I think are important. So, universal health care, if you're for that, then I'm going to vote for you as an independent, as somebody who's pretty middle of the road, rather than voting for somebody who's just Republican light, the way that many of the people were on offer. But I'm here in a swing state of Wisconsin where, it's sort of like anything goes. If I was in Tennessee, maybe not, So I don't think that you can say that the left, espousing policies of the left hurt or helped Democrats per se. I think what you can say is that there's two things that you can say. One is that now that Biden is in office, so under a Biden regime, anybody who's on the left ought to be pushing super hard to get some of these things enacted. You're not going to get everything, but you can certainly say, hey, reconsider Medicare for all. I'm cool with repeating that message every day to Biden, because I think that's an important policy. The other thing about the left-right thing, so people have pointed out that part of what drove the voting is the organizing on the part of people on the left to deliver votes for the Biden-Harris campaign. And that will often be taken for granted, just as oftentimes the African-American vote is, it's relied upon and then taken for granted. And they have to push too, Actually, that was great. The celebration that was out in the park yesterday, that's exactly what the message was. Fortunately, we won. Now we got to organize. Now we got to keep pushing hard to get these center, not even center left, just center Democrats to deliver on what they ought to do. So that's a good question. Hey, Bruce, good to see you here as well. All right, let me pick up another question here. Gutter Groan says, I hope Trump isn't going to try to intimidate the Electoral College votes. So you mean the electors themselves? I think Trump is basically done. I think he's like a lot of other blowhards and bullies. he's gotten a really rough, bop on the nose, and he's going to go off and sulk and whine and complain. And he'll be on TV and he'll try to do things. But now he has to actually worry about prosecution and investigations, right? So he's also probably like literally, crapping a brick at this point in time. I don't think he's going to try to do anything really. All right. Jason says, it seems like in the earlier part of the 20th century, the distribution between liberal and conservative academics was more even than it is now. Any theory why it is so skewed lib now? It's not really skewed lib. It's all over the map. It depends on what college you're at. I mean, this is one of the bugaboos of the right. They love to say, oh, college, and then they have this like monolithic thing that they think college is. You gotta like, I mean, spend some time in a non-elite college or something that's not on the East Coast or the West Coast here in the Midwest. You're going to find a wide range of college professors. And, it also depends on what college you're looking at. Go to a business or economics school within a university or an engineering school. You are going to find a lot of conservatives there. You're even going to find a lot of people reading and talking about Ayn Rand. You go into humanities departments, maybe less so, right? But you're still going to find a pretty good distribution. So, the other thing is too, I would say that there's some conservatives that just aren't going to entertain going to college, right? And so there's a proportion of that. I don't think looking at our current crop of college students, and I teach in a number of different places, that they're particularly leftist, either when they come in or when they go out. It depends, again, on the institution. Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, School of Designers and Artists, much more liberal than Milwaukee Area Technical College, than Marquette University, or vice versa. All right. Lokesh says, I think Trumpism is more than a cult, shares a lot of characteristics, but what it specifically does is blur the line between religion and the state. It's a shaping of a new political identity. Yeah, kind of. I mean, I would call it a proto-fascism. I mean, as somebody who researches far-right movements, starting with like Action Française and integral nationalism, and then fascism, National Socialism, all that sort of stuff. It's pretty, the writing is pretty clear in the way that they've behaved and the things that they've done and the rhetoric that they've used. They're within that spectrum. I don't think it's going to survive all that long. It'll probably metastasize into something else down the line, All right, Mike Remington, why are you guys cutting family out of your life over some political ideology? Left and right are not that far apart on things. I'd say that's wrong. Left and right are pretty far apart on things. And I would say that, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party on important measures are quite a bit different from each other, perhaps more than they were 20 years ago. And I think it's perfectly fine. I mean, you could cut family out of your life for other reasons. I mean, you can always go back to them. It's not like you're, cutting a bridge and destroying it forever, right? I mean, you would do so with people who are abusers. You can do so with people who don't cope with their addictions properly. Sometimes that's what you have to do. Craig says guns lead to arguments, which lead to guns. Yeah, that's a problem. There's a cycle there. All right. Xenocrat says, in some families, that's true. Europe thinks we have two conservative parties, one on the right, one further to the right. Yeah, that is quite true. A lot of Americans lack fundamental perspective when talking about left and right. The Democratic Party is pretty centrist, So, Mason, you said you're neither liberal nor conservative, but a virtue ethicist. What does this look like in practice as a virtue ethicist in politics? Well, I've said it. I look at policies and I pick the ones that I think are actually serving some sort of common good. I think that character counts for something. That was part of why I very early on had to say, I'll give Trump the benefit of the doubt. but he didn't deserve it. And neither did the people who he put in power. Neither, even like the people who were supposedly there to check him, showed themselves to lack character in the end, like Kelly, for example. I think that matters. I think that we should be working for justice. I think that we need to look at the dispositions that we have ourselves, and how we engage in politics, because it could be too easy to give in to anger and then have this endless cycle. That's a problem on both left and right. It can be too easy to become super anxious about things. I'll tell you this, if you want to understand what virtue ethics looks like in politics, and you want to look at it in terms of old schools of virtue ethics, read Aristotle's Politics. See what he actually has to say. It's a very nuanced view. He says, there are going to be these competing things. He focuses primarily on the rich and the many, and he says both of them understand justice in a certain way, but both of them are skewed. And then we need the people who actually keep society functioning, the aristoi, the best, the good, the people who develop virtues, and are usually like, what the hell is this bullshit coming from these two sets of selfish morons who kind of get some things right. Aristotle didn't pull any punches. He said that every one of the currently existing Greek city-states was defective, or you can look at the Stoics. They put forward a virtue ethics as well, and they participated in politics, as best as they could. They didn't withdraw from it. So it also means being strategic. If the Democratic Party turns into a bunch of whack jobs tomorrow, I'll be voting against them. I was pretty critical. I've been pretty critical of most administrations during the course of my lifetime. So yeah. All right. Let's see what we got here. There's a lot of back and forth. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Jeff asks a question here. Any thoughts on the trade-off between ideals and pragmatism? Watching AOC attack the new entire Democratic coalition makes me worry, even if I generally agree with the progressive policies. I wouldn't say she's actually attacking. I mean, I read her Twitter stream. I would say there's a difference between attacking and rightly pointing stuff out. And she's actually like responding to people saying, oh, you shouldn't talk about defund the police. She's like, well, those who refuse to talk about that lost a lot of their seats. So if you want to call that an attack, I guess you can. She also pointed out that a lot of the people who lost had really crap ground games, including their electronics communication. And it's funny that you bring up like idealism or ideals and pragmatism. Pragmatists have ideals. Pragmatists, in the sense of like actual American pragmatism, the philosophy, would say that we push and we take our ideals and we put them into practice, and we try to fight for them, and eventually they become realities, right? And there's going to be some give and take, but pragmatism and ideals are not opposed to each other. It's not like there's a continuum with pragmatism on one end. What you mean is expediency. What you mean is what they call the useful or the expedient rather than the pragmatic, because pragmatism always presumes that we have some like substantive goals in mind. Otherwise, it's just kind of an unmoored sort of like listening to wherever the wind is blowing and going that way. All right, let's see here. Mike says, you're lumping whole groups as if they're a single Borg like mine, name calling, really. Come on, man. Maybe take people as individuals and not worry about what they say. So that's totally unrealistic. When we're talking about politics, especially in a nation of over 300 million people, we are going to not just like talk about each little individual, and we are going to talk about categories. The question is whether we're accurate or whether we're off base when we're doing that. So, it's usually when people bring that up, they're being very selective, because nobody doesn't do that, right? Nobody treats every single person as an individual. And if you want to think of it as name calling, well, maybe this isn't for you. I don't have a problem calling a spade or a crazy a crazy. And we've had 4 years of a thoroughly nutty, corrupt, degenerate, regime in place that just brought a lot of chaos and worsened outcomes for people in so many different ways, indulged in cruelty. You want to think of that as name calling? That's your choice. I would call it being accurate about our political situation, but that's life. All right. Forced convalescence. Biden used China to interfere with the election. So there's no grounds for that, and that's really ridiculous. I'm going to put that one into a timeout. All right, Carter, love the Constitution car analogy. Just curious, who did you like in the Democratic primaries? Oh, okay. I actually voted for Sanders, in part because he was the candidate who was actually pushing forth the things that I thought needed to be addressed. I didn't have super high hopes for what he was going to accomplish, and it turned out that the Democratic Party as a whole really, did him in, which angered. Whoa, did that anger a lot of people who were for the first time quite enthusiastic about politics. And it's the second time around. Would a Sanders administration have been perfect? No. I think there would have been some issues where, now from more conservative point of view, I would have had to say, hey, pump the brakes on that, buddy, right? But I think that it would have been going more in the right direction on a number of different things. So, yeah. But I mean, here's something I can say. I live in Wisconsin, and so by the time that we get to primaries here in Wisconsin, the fix is kind of in. There's not much that we're in April. So Super Tuesdays happened. All these other things have happened. We don't really get much say. This is part of the problem with the process as we have it set up right now. There are so many ways in which our system, if you want to call it that, is militates against any real democracy. And by democracy, I don't just mean everybody votes or mob rule or something like that. I mean where we have a real substantive, like hashing things out, everybody's voices getting heard in some respect, and being addressed. We just don't have that. There's so many ways in which our system is flawed in that way. All right, Renzo says the Democratic coalition, the younger progressives are attacking, are the people who let Trump come to power. The Democratic coalition, I guess to some degree. I mean, putting forth, so going back 4 years, right? Clinton was a terrible candidate. The idea that somehow she deserved to be in place, and the sidelining of Sanders and really anything that he had to say, and the lack of any other alternatives, and bringing in all these Democratic insiders who are essentially just elites and don't really care about the ordinary person, that turned people off. That opened the door for Trump. And so, picking another group like that, like here's a great example. Rahm Emanuel, who is, secretary under Obama, shouldn't have been in there, right? Brought in basically as a Clinton insider. And then, he was mayor of Chicago for a while. He's just a garbage person across the board. He's a terrible person. He should have been kicked out of the Democratic Party a long time ago, but he's got juice. He's got connections, and he's still spouting nonsense on Twitter. Nobody should listen to him, but that's the kind of person who they brought in. Or Donna Brazile, or now I'm blanking on her name. She was the party chairperson for a while, also instrumental. So yeah, people like that open the door. The Democrats have to be the better party, right? If the Republicans aren't going to be. To be the better party, not for their elites, not just for their donors, but for ordinary people. Craig brings up an old saying. They say you haven't got a heart if not liberal when you're young, and you haven't got head when you're not conservative when you're old. I mean, people do become more conservative when they have more of a stake in the system. Do older people who are finding that healthcare is bankrupting them and wind up having to come out of retirement to work at Walmart, are they do they have a stake in the system, or are they screwed by the system? You know, that's a good question to ask about that. I think that saying presumes a certain kind of continuity of life that isn't there. Let's see here. Jason says, isn't that synonymous with saying, well, we can afford to be a bit bad because they're really bad? There is a degree of moral equivalency in that argument, and that's a tough pill to swallow. Well, it's not a degree of moral equivalency. You either have moral equivalency or you don't. So it's not a degree thing. And no, it's putting things in proportion. I mean, unless you expect people to be saints, which they're not, and you shouldn't, we're going to deal with better and worse. That's a fundamental part of ethics, right? It's not just about the good or the bad. It's about the better or the worse. And, you know, this is like all the way going back to Aristotle and the Stoics and Cicero and all these great thinkers. So, no, I think, and if you want to call like saying that we shouldn't extend an olive branch to Trumpers who have no interest in cooperating with anybody is something bad, I guess we differ on that. So, yeah. Let's see. I'm going to drop down a bit. There's some back and forth here. Mariana says 4 years are not as scary with Trump when we realize Biden should be taken care of instead of being paraded. That's just kind of silly. I think Biden is doing fine. All right. Morgan says Bernie shouldn't have called himself a democratic socialist when he was actually a moderate and pushed for policies found in other countries. You know, that might be. I mean, if he didn't call himself a socialist, everyone would be. I don't know that you can really repackage what he's doing here in the American. You're right. Here in the American system, we are pretty far right as far as like what, you know, rational policies would be and the things that we can accept. All right, it skipped down a bit, so I gotta see where we are. A lot of back and forth discussion here. Somebody says, did you even know the meaning of fascism? Buddy, I've written articles on it. So yeah, I kind of do. People want to try to debate that, you know, good luck to you. Let's see here. Where are we? Oh, Aaron says, thanks for your hard work, especially for sharply and clearly articulating these nuances. Thanks very much. Glad that you like that. All right. Wow, there's a lot of back and forth stuff here. Fatal Remains says, what makes something a cult isn't its political stance. It can be, actually. There's a wide range of things that are cults. Also, Trump's mishandling of China's stupid tariff wars only allowed China to gain and strengthen influence. Yeah, he when it comes to foreign policy, the Trump administration was really a hot mess. And the Chinese have been pretty happy with you know what Trump is doing. They come at, I mean, they have some weaknesses in their system as well that have to be dealt with before too long, but they're coming at things from a position of strength. Trump's tariffs really decimated people here in various industries in the Midwest, I'll say too. So, all right, let's see. Ergonomics says Biden is Bush 2.0. No way Marxist-Leninists get anything they wanted. Yeah, I don't know that Biden is Bush 2.0. I think that's kind of a silly thing to say. There are some differences, but there is a lot of continuity between them. Alex says COVID will be the excuse for awkward family holidays. Yeah, that's quite true. F to Ref says people voted for Biden because he isn't Trump. It was sufficient to get him elected, so I don't think the left will get anything they want. It depends on how much the left pushes, you know. You got to really avoid these oversimplistic, the left is going to get what they want or they're not going to get what they want. It's going to be a package, you know, where you get like a bit of this and then you don't get this and a bit of this and don't get this. And it's going to depend how much people mobilize and how much people fight for these sorts of things. Renzo says the West has a long history of installing dictatorships to keep their economic relationships. That's fine, but that doesn't really have much to do with this election. All right, well, there's a lot of back and forth about totalitarian regimes that I'm gonna skip over. Mariana says if you go to MIT, you'll find Epstein's buddies. Apparently, sure. So what? A lot of those Epstein's buddies were hanging out with the Republicans, who are the ones who gave him an easy deal, right? People are crappy all over the place, right? Is that the basic idea? Barklord, my philosophy teacher in community college, was an Ayn Rand fan. I had a colleague at Marist who was an Ayn Rand scholar. You know, they're out there. There's quite a few of them. All right, let's see if we can find our way to something kind of substantive. Okay, here's a good question. Rishi, how do you think the Biden administration will work around a Republican Senate? It's nice that Biden won, but it feels like without the Senate, it almost feels like a symbolic victory to me. Well, if you think that it's only a symbolic victory, then you underrate what can be done through the executive agency. You know, Reagan had to go with a Democratic Senate, right? You often have these split things. So it means that you have to push forth an agenda. Biden was in the Senate. He knows a lot of these people. He can probably, you know, it's funny because Trump was like, I'm an outsider. I'm going to fix all this stuff. Sometimes you actually need an insider who can engage in that sort of wheeling and dealing. It's likely that Mitch McConnell, so long as the Republicans retain control of the Senate, is just going to engage in as much obstruction as possible. But that's going to be damaging to them in 2022. You know, we're going to try to vote out Ron Johnson here in Wisconsin. He's up for election in 2022, and he's on record as, you know, saying a lot of dumb stuff and engaging in a lot of obstruction. So he's pretty vulnerable. You'll often see in my Twitter stream, you know, the hashtag Vote Ron Out 2022, because we're going to remember, right? So, but you can do so much with executive orders. You can do so much by what you fund, what you don't fund. You can do so much by how things work in the various departments, whether education. I mean, think about just getting rid of Betsy DeVos, you know, from the Department of Education. Huge difference already right there, you know? She was turning things backwards and actually not even going back to a screwed up past, but like trying to make things as bad as possible within her organization. Get rid of also the sort of like taking civil service jobs and trying to turn them essentially into, you know, you're with us or against us, patronage jobs that the Trump administration was doing. There's going to be a lot of changes. So not controlling the Senate is not totally neutering the incoming Biden administration. Cody says, do you think it's better to reform the Democrats to adopt progressive policies from within, outside, or some mix? Everything in politics works better with some mix, broad spectrum things. You'll see independents like me telling them, hey, if you want to keep getting our independent vote in swing states, you better actually start endorsing some of these things. And I'm not going to be saying swing left. I'm going to be saying Medicare for all. I'm going to be saying overseeing, you know, policing, you know, breaking down these old boy blue networks and stuff like that. I'm going to be saying focus on domestic terrorists, rein in the militias, you know, these sorts of things. And I'll be saying it from over here, and the leftists can say it from over there, and other people can say it from other places. And when you've got a broad base like that, people are often like, ooh, it's not just this one group that's saying this. We better get our crap together because you know, we're really going to get, you know, our butts handed to us if we don't do that. Let's see. My dog is going crazy with all these dog whistles in chat. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see here. FDRF says, do you think the Supreme Court will throw out election results out of loyalty to Trump? So that's actually a good point to talk about. The Supreme Court can only act on cases that are brought to them. And interestingly, Roberts has been showing signs of, he was appointed by Bush. And Roberts and Alito, to a certain extent, have been siding on important cases with the liberals on the court, in part because they're like, this is enough bullshit from these people who don't have no business being here, like Kavanaugh. I think they're kind of sick of some of the nonsense, and so they're going to be more of a centrist thing. It's not going to go to the Supreme Court, though, I don't think. I mean, I could be totally wrong about this. Maybe somebody will find some case that would somehow fix things. But here's the deal. You can bring a case about a particular state. If you flip one of the states, does Biden lose and Trump win? Nope, not with the results as we have them now. So even if you manage to flip Pennsylvania, which is not going to happen, it still wouldn't, I think, get Trump the victory that he wants. And the cases that the Trump lawyers have been bringing are so egregiously bad that judges have been like rolling their eyes and saying, you got to be kidding me. You're taking my time up with this BS? So I don't think it's going to go to the Supreme Court. All right, let's see here. Some back and forth. Some back and forth here about racism. Zeitgeist says, what do you think about diversity race quotas? I think discriminating on the basis of race is racist, even though it's for non-racist reasons. It depends on the situation. I think sometimes if the racism has been egregious enough to like keep people out of particular positions, I don't have a problem with opening things up and saying, you're going to hire somebody of this group, or you're going to hire a woman. Should it be a long-term thing? Probably not. I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor, reflecting on the Supreme Court case back, how long ago? That was like in the Bush administration, I believe, or maybe it was in the Obama administration, was talking about equal opportunity in admissions for colleges. And she was like, still need it right now, but 20 years from now, we should get rid of it. So I think that's something that we do have to be, rather pragmatic about. X-Christ said, I've always wanted to get into American pragmatism. I admire Dewey a lot. Yeah, Dewey's okay. He's not the most easy writer to read because he's like Hegel. He's not a great stylist. So, all right. Hank Quinlan, are you familiar with Leo Strauss's assertion all post-Enlightenment permissive liberalism ends in totalitarianism? He suggested Aristotle's virtue theory is an alternative. Yeah, I've read a lot of Leo Strauss. I encountered Strauss back as a graduate student. I don't take him seriously or Straussians seriously. He's interesting to read. Somebody asked me about him yesterday in terms of like secondary lit. So yeah, I'll like read him on Hobbes, and occasionally he'll get some stuff right that's worth putting into a paper, but I don't. I think as a cultural critic, Strauss is way off base. So, all right. Let's see. Try to get some stuff from people that I haven't taken some questions from before. Some discussion about Thomas Sowell, somebody else I don't take seriously, having read him as an undergraduate and back in graduate school. I mean, he's sort of second rate, but if you're into him, that's fine. There's better stuff you could spend your time on. But all right, let's see here. So Jeff asked, what do you think needs to be addressed by the Democratic Party? Universal health care, universal basic income. I don't think we're going to see a universal basic income, unfortunately. And a little bit earlier, I was saying we have some really big problems on the horizon. One of them is the changing work labor marketplace, right? As we have more and more automation and AI and things like that, I think we're going to see pretty high rates of unemployment. And we may need to do something like a universal basic income. But I think we should talk about it now, but I think the policy discussions about it are going to happen long off. It's cool that they are doing experiments in different places like Finland or Canada, or even, I think there's a few going on here in the United States where they're like doing a community and then they target them with a universal basic income. And that can be kind of helpful. I think universal health care, we're going to have to enact it at some time or another, or we're screwed. Homelessness, one of the main reasons people are homeless, medical debt. People go bankrupt over medical debt. One reason why our COVID response has been so awful wasn't just the incompetency of the Trump administration and the denial that a real problem was taking place. It was, even if we had a good administration in place, our healthcare system, which is not a system, but a whole bunch of interlocking systems, much of which is for profit, was just not up to the task. So people weren't getting tested when they should. We're not really doing contact tracing. And COVID is out of control here. And we've had, several 100,000 people die now at this point who didn't need to. Alex asks, what do you know about terms like democratic modernity? I mean, they're vague terms. They can mean anything that you want them to. Yeah, they always have to be indexed to a particular group or theorist or movement that is using them, I would say. Jason asks, on the Electoral College, if you could wave the proverbial magic wand, would you prefer the popular vote, each state going to the Nebraska model, or something different? I mean, I think I would want to go to something like a parliamentary system where you vote for the party and then the party chooses their leader. And I would like to see ranked choice voting as well, where having runoffs or things like that. Whatever's going to make it more participatory, more democratic than what we currently have. And I would say, something that has to go along with this is we need way more accountability on the part of politicians. It's really easy to say, well, you hold them accountable by voting them out. But in our gerrymandered system, it's impossible to vote so many of the representatives out. It's tough to vote governors out. And so I think we have to have way more accountability. All right. Here's a great one by Cody. How much of an influence does money in politics affect things? Will we ever end money in politics, possibly a constitutional amendment? Well, to start with, there aren't going to be any constitutional amendments. That's just not going to happen. Not in our lifetime. Not with things the way they are. So unless we have some sort of radical shift and a unity government of some sort, we're not going to have a constitutional amendment. Money in politics, major problem. Citizens United basically allowed, that's a court decision, basically allowed corporations to be, count their political contributions as free speech. And it's gotten much worse since then. Many of the big corporations play both sides by funding candidates on either side, and we have tons. There really ought to be limits, and on any sizable donation, there should be like limits to the point of how much you can do, and there should be ways to make sure that you can't get around it by having all your employees donate in your name or something like that. So that is a huge problem. Crusade says, is there something defective in our politics, or is it just the polity that causes us to put up such really bad candidates? That's a great question. I think so there's a couple things going on. One of the problems is that in the way our system works, right, where leadership develops generally at a lower level, and then it's going up to higher and higher levels, and eventually like you become a senator or a governor, and then you can run for president or things like that. You have to make so many compromises along the way that like, think about Illinois politics, right? When people were saying about, oh, this Obama guy, hope and change, I was like, who the hell thinks that this guy is going to change anything? He's just another Chicago machine politician who was, somebody's favorite, brought in essentially to run against Alan Keyes because they needed somebody else who was African American to run against him. And he takes orders, his whole career from all these, Illinois politicians. You think he's actually going to be hope and change? He's just another same type of politician. And sure enough, that's the way he behaved, big surprise. The other problem is that once people make it into the political system, and here I'm going to engage in some class analysis, they become part of a political class. And there's so many opportunities for enrichment. Anybody who thinks that, for example, the Obamas or the Clintons or the Bushes or any of these people have anything in common with working people, or even people who are like solidly upper middle class, you're nuts. They've made their millions. They can continue to make their millions. They can give a speech and make more money in one speech than I can in years of work. That's a totally different reality. They can't be expected to have the interests of other people, the majority of people at heart. And it's surprising that so many of them manage to do some of that. So, yeah, so that is a big problem. All right, Ted says, I'm a Republican who voted Biden, but I'm so happy libertarian voters voted third party and showed it has an impact. This is where it gets into interesting territory. I think pretty soon we're going to see the blame game getting played by Republicans against libertarians who are going to be saying they screwed up the election, just like Democrats were so mad at people who voted for Jill Stein and the Greens, or who voted libertarian in the last election, right? Because the libertarian vote in some of those contested states is definitely enough that it would have shifted the state one way or the other. I saw a really funny thing on Twitter where I don't know who posted it, but it was a libertarian who said, if all the Republicans had just voted libertarian, the libertarians would have actually won. And then it showed an electoral map where it's all yellow, right? And that's a good retort, right? Somebody else had a nice thing. They chimed in, Ayn Rand defeated Ayn Rand. Not all libertarians, of course, are Randians, but there's a significant influence there. Yeah, and it's interesting that the libertarians, looking at the results, and I haven't gone through state by state by state. I like to do sort of analysis after elections. I haven't looked at exactly what the impact is, but it looks like the libertarians were the only third party that really managed to draw a significant vote in most places. The Greens were there in some places, Constitution Party. There's a few other parties, but none of them came anywhere close to the Libertarians. So it's kind of interesting to see. All right. Let's see what else we got here. Blah, blah, blah. Some back and forth arguments. Eric W., did Greg talk about how both parties are co-opted by the ownership class? How could this change? Will it ever? I mean, they're both beholden, you could say, to certain corporate interests and a lot of rich families. I would say that it depends on what part of the party you're talking about. I mean, the Tea Party was a reaction against that, and then it got colonized almost immediately, right? I don't know that the left wing of the Democratic Party, they're usually arguing about this being so problematic. You're in your pocket of the banks or things like that. So, all right, let's see here. I just jumped a little bit. Let me scroll up a little bit. A lot of back and forth. All right, so here's a good point by Ken Blackwell. Thankfully, Trump was an obvious incompetent. Imagine if there had been someone competent and charismatic there instead of in 2016. What safeguards could be put in place to guard against this? That is indeed what a lot of people are worried about. What if somebody mobilizes the same forces that Trump was able to mobilize to beat out all the other Republicans? Because remember, think about what the primaries were like in 2016. You know, Jeb Bush was the front runner, and there were other people like Rubio and Cruz, and Trump, managed to displace all of them, managed to say things that were clearly racist, all sorts of other problematic. I mean, he's just a horrible character, right? And people would be like, "Wow, that's got to bury him." And then he got even more support among Republicans, and people were like, I guess that sells, right? And yeah, he's a mess. He's a businessman who runs businesses into the ground and doesn't pay people when he's supposed to. He's mentally, he's not particularly bright, doesn't have the capacity to focus his attention. None of this is news to anybody. And yet he was able to be president and dominate our policy making for quite a while. What happens when we get a competent one to deal with? That is a concern, a real worry. So, all right. The game philosopher. Here's a question. What would Cicero say, in your opinion, on the election and its results? Well, that's an interesting thing to ask, because people asked, how can you possibly be supporting Biden? Trump is bad, but Biden is also bad, right? And people brought this up because, I do a lot of work in the modern Stoic movement. And then I said, well, what do you think happened in the Civil War? Did Cicero and Cato say, oh, they're both bad, I can't really support either one? No, they actually, for a while they could be, they were neutral. And then they're like, Caesar is worse. Got to side with this scumbag Pompey. We'll figure out what to do after the war is done. And then they lost their war, right? I think of it that way. Cicero would look at somebody like Trump and be like, wow, I cannot believe that people support somebody like that. What does that say about their character that they do that? He'd probably have some significant complaints about Biden on a lot of counts, right? As well. So, Ex-Crusade has a policy thing, universalizing housing vouchers rather than making it first come, first serve would really help a lot of families. That would help a number of people. Yeah. I think this is actually quite right by Bled Back to Life. When Americans say they fear socialism, what they really mean is they fear equality and fairness. And I would say that formally that's not correct, but materially that is correct. Much of what gets called socialism and then attacked for that reason really is about equality and fairness. And this is where, again, being a virtue ethicist, universal healthcare, no brainer, making sure that nobody is starving, no brainer, especially when we have so much plenty in this country and it wouldn't ruin the economy to do so. Making sure that people mask up and don't get their fellow citizens sick, no brainer, but people are like, oh, that's terrible, and that's just a sign of how screwed up their thinking is from a cognitive perspective, that they can't call things what they are. We do have a big problem with this, worry about the word socialism here. So, all right, let's go on. So Andre says, can you talk about how to deal with the widespread impression of this being an illegitimate election among the Trump supporters? I lean Trump up my favorite outcome right now. So it wasn't a illegitimate election. And the way to deal with it is to keep saying, sorry, buddy, you're wrong about that. And if you want to like keep on saying your stuff, ways to tell them they're wrong. I just keep pushing back and pushing back and pushing back. And if they want to, if they want to be crazy, which is basically what it comes down to, then you treat them like crazies. That's all there is to it. I mean, for some of the people, seeing Trump defeated and slouching around and how petulant and stuff like that, that's going to make them think a bit. And they're going to come out of some of their bravado, and some of them will also like see there'll be some court cases, and then you can point at the court cases getting thrown out over and over again. And then there's the ones who are always going to be with the good old stab in the back, and you're never going to convince them because they're so invested in that, but they're going to be a smaller minority, and that's what we do. I mean, how do you treat children who come up with crazy ideas? Do you like just beat them down? Do you just say, oh, I'll entertain your nutty ideas? Or do you do something that's kind of like, well, you can think whatever you like, but the adults over here are going to do things this way. I think that's how we do it. Oh, here's a great one by Wavy. Do you think de Tocqueville's descriptions of American culture in the 19th century still hold up today? Some things, yes. Some things, no. His whole discussion about American associationism and intermediate associations, I think, has been gutted. Our civic and social life is very much at the level of governmentality rather than people getting together in that way. De Tocqueville was right in saying in Democracy in America that America's great sin is he was saying the red and the black races, and that sooner or later America had better figure out what it's doing to fix that. He's right about that. I think that what he was claiming about, like, for example, French democracy, when people would have a squabble, they'd immediately turn to the state. I think that has become the de facto for both the Republican and the Democratic Party. The Republicans used to be a party of limited government. That's not the case anymore. They love governmentality, so long as it serves the purposes that they want. So they aren't really a party of limited government. And de Tocqueville thought that Americans could kind of manage their own affairs. So both parties are devoted to, like, taking hold of power and doing things with it. Let's see here. Try to find somebody who I haven't taken a question from yet before. So I'm not monetizing dissent. Says Trump is the spectacle incarnate, capital accumulated to the point that it becomes a pure image. If you accept the principles of capitalism, Trump figures are inevitable. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that media theory stuff. I think there's probably more going on than that. Oh, here's a good policy question from Xenocrat. What do you think about expanding the Supreme Court? If you're for it, how would you justify it? I think if the Democrats want to expand the Supreme Court, I'm cool with that. The Republicans played so much politics with courts over the years. I don't think they have a leg to stand on. The fact that they held up a Supreme Court appointment just so that they could get their own person in, once they cross that line, this is a broader issue too I'm going to talk about. So I've been observing a breakdown in our political processes really since I started paying attention to it. I would say, from the 1990s onward, where both sides would do something and you're like, man, you shouldn't do that. You should, I know it's going to get you a temporary advantage, but you're starting to do things that are really clearly partisan. And when the next party comes into power, they're going to do exactly the same thing. And you're really not going to have a moral right to complain about that, though you will bitch and whine about it. And you're doing inevitable damage to the whole system itself. And for people like me who don't belong to either of your parties, what you're showing us is that we can't trust either of you, and that it really is just becoming hyper-partisan. So I think that what the Republicans have been doing over the last, essentially decade in terms of court appointments as much as possible, holding them up and then, shoving as many people in. I mean, it makes sense from a position of expediency of just getting power, but it's done so much damage to the republic and to the capacity for sides like respecting certain boundaries. They don't have anything to complain about, and so I don't think there has to be a justification for it, quite frankly. I think once you've started playing that much politics, you don't get to complain. So that's what I think about that, and that's a broader issue. Let's see if I can take one more question from somebody else who hasn't said something previously, because then we're going to bring this to a close because I got to get on with work for the day. Who is a new voice in here? Well, I don't think Alex has said anything, but he just says my libertarian friends are telling me this is happening, but I'm not sure what that's referring to. Let's see if I can find somebody else who I haven't done. Mateus asks, is capitalism pushing something like the Chinese model for the U.S.? I don't think so. Capitalism by itself is an abstraction. Okay, so here's something I could go out on. Jeff Weber, I know you're a fan of Dune. Any other fiction that touched on politics that you would suggest? Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of speculative fiction that touches on politics. Philip K. Dick's novels are, there's lots of discussions about what's going on in political systems there, right? Ranging from like alternate histories, I'm blanking on it. It's the one with the Nazis and the Japanese. One of my favorite novels by him. But there's all sorts of ones as well. But I would say, provided mankind actually survives and makes it out to the stars, think about C.J. Chera's Alliance Union universe. There's a lot of really interesting political discussion going on in there, as well as a lot of technical discussion. I almost joked at one point that you almost needed to put a spreadsheet together to understand exactly what's going on in Down Below Station. I think Ursula K. Le Guin as well. Somebody who's approaching political questions. This will be something that we're talking about in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction later on this month, at the end of the month. There's a lot of authors who are working with things George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones, right? There's a lot of really interesting political discussions. It's important not to just get into the sort of Dark Lord versus, plucky Hobbit characters, good versus evil thing, I would say. But we also do have to recognize when there genuinely is evil at play. That's one of the things that I particularly liked about The Man in the High Castle. That's the name. Yeah. In the book, not the Amazon TV series, in the book, there's a clear recognition that the Japanese, although a militaristic society, are much more humane than the Nazis, who have managed to take over things and who are driven by sort of a nihilistic and opportunistic will to power, and have to be stopped. So I'd say there's lots of interesting speculative fiction that we could look to. Much of it is not directly applicable to our immediate situation, but it's worth reading. It doesn't automatically have to provide us with clear solutions. So, all right, on that, I am going to end this. Thanks for all of your questions, comments, and hopefully we, make it through all of this, and there won't be, hopefully, a lot of post-election violence, and we can have a transition and then start figuring out where we need to go next.